Hello, happy Tuesday from AP Comparative Government. Welcome back to Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. I'm Mr. Andrew Canine, and we are making our way to help you prepare for that AP Comparative exam on May 22nd. We're making our way through Unit 3. And today and tomorrow, we are looking at political participation, and I've decided to go controversial today. We're not going to call it an argument essay today. We're going to call it a rant essay because I have written a rant for you, but I hope that it gives you some insight to help you prepare for not only the content that's fair game for the AP Comparative Government, but also for the mechanics and the writing skills that you're going to have to demonstrate to earn that honor score on AP Comparative Government. So thank you again for tuning in, no matter whether you're a regular viewer, a live viewer, a recorded. Oh my gosh, some of you stay up so late. Go to bed early. Go to bed early. Manage that time. But thank you, regardless of when you're watching, to get prepared for AP Comparative Government. As always, download the course description. It's super helpful. I take a lot of my material straight from the course description. It's really transparent if I'm going to take a comparative word. It's really transparent, particularly in some of the content knowledge. You can go directly to the link for the PDF for the course description, or you can go to our website. That's the Two Teachers put together by Mr. Dan Larson at citizenu.org. Make sure you go to that hot link, the comparative corner, where you can download a lot of my notes that I'm using in these slides. You can see and read that information, that supplemental information, particularly from units 1, 2, and 3, some more specific country information. By the end of unit 3, when we get to the end of the unit 3, I'm going to put all the FRQs that I've been writing and using on these YouTube lessons. I'm going to put a document on CitizenU so that you can see all of those FRQs if that would help you. So I will do that at the end of Unit 3, so you have a document with all these FRQs, because I'm trying to write these particular FRQs the way that College Board has described these questions. If you go to this website, apcoronavirusupdates.collegeboard.org, you can see information about all of your AP tests, the test dates, the test times. They're describing the questions on there. And that's what I'm using to build these questions on as I get into the questions that we'll do toward the end of every lesson. So of course, we start off with shout outs. I want to give a special shout out to Mr. Kerry Waxler down at Barrington High School, right down the road from me, who had a terrific current event at AP CompGov 2020 about Russia's response to coronavirus and the difficulty that government officials are having in Russia getting some citizens to comply with government mandates, because there's a lack of trust in some elements by Russian citizens in what some of the motives are of government officials. And I think he's dead on. It really goes into that question of political legitimacy. Who do you listen to? Who are those experts in science, in economics, in government, when there's a lot of uncertainty? Who are those experts? That we call that legitimacy. And of course, Alex Dewey, Ben Rocks, Chris G are back with examples on hashtag CompGov 2020 with insightful questions and some writing samples. So make sure you get into Twitter. Our Nigerian activists were back pushing out some questions and concerns about Nigeria governmental response to COVID-19. And Shay asked a terrific question. Thank you very much. Yesterday, I was doing a lot of name dropping with Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping in the last couple of lessons, some dates I was dropping in, particularly when it comes to economic policy. And Shay asked, and I'm glad she asked this, do you have to drop names and dates into your writing in comparative government? And the answer is no. This is not a name test or a date test, unless, of course, there's an infographic or some kind of data set that connects with names and dates. I mean, that would be fair game if it's part of a data set. But typically, yeah, you can describe country-specific evidence without having to drop a specific leader's name or a specific date in that case. So, but if you know names, if you know dates, if you're well versed on economic history or economic case studies or different examples, for sure use those. But that's not an expectation um, in an argument essay. So thank you for that great question, Shay. I want to give you a preview of my, again, I'm not going to call it an argument essay, I'm calling it the rant essay today. Develop an argument that explains whether political participation through referendum is effective at establishing political legitimacy. And this is kind of this modified structure that we've been told. You can get more information at that website I showed you earlier, where instead of having 3 course concepts to choose from in your argument essay, you're only going to have 1 course concept, and you got to link that course concept into your writing. And also, you're going to be restricted on the number of countries. You're going to be told the different countries that you can use as country examples. So I'm going to give you the prompt. As always, we're going to talk about this later after I do the lesson, and hopefully there's some content from today's lesson, topic 3.5, that you'll find helpful to answer this question if you might be a little questionable right now on how you would answer this. And I'm also going to show you what countries that I've designed this question, I've written, that I think could be fair game to answer a question. You can try to infer from the lesson what countries you think would be fair game or what countries you would want to write about. But remember that with this new modified question, you're going to be directed to answer with 1 or 2 of a provided number of countries. You can't select from all 6 anymore. So I'm going to show you an example of that as I rant about this prompt later in today's lesson. We are looking at 3.5. We have 2 days on political participation. That's how important political participation is. And you're going to learn political participation is not just important in democracies. Certainly participation is crucial to democracy, but we also see authoritarian regimes allowing certain types of participation, shaping certain types of participation. You're going to see that both today and tomorrow. And of course, this links to that bigger idea of democratization, which I think is one of those great concepts to really understand in AP comparative government. We are making our way through, particularly focused on the first 3 units, because that's what the College Board has told you that you should be prepared for, and particularly those course concepts from unit 1, 2, and 3. But you're going to see a lot of connections with our other units. And I've already mentioned quite a bit of that before. So today, as we focus on the course concepts for every topic, you should certainly know political participation. We're going back to that oldie and a goodie, political legitimacy, which I certainly put in the prompt. You saw that. We have an interesting reference to what's called a safety valve. If you can kind of think ahead and predict, how do you think safety valve fits into this concept of political participation? Also, again, I'm not going to say it's my favorite concept because I'm going to rant on this later, but it's one of the most interesting concepts, I think, in political science, and that is a referenda or a referendum, singular, referenda, plural, and Brexit. We see definitely a inference that you should know what Brexit is. And so that's what makes today's topic so particularly juicy. So you tuned in for a really, really good one, 3.5. When you get into that course description, I want you to note that anything that I have, any paragraph that I've asterisked here is essentially directly coming from the College Board's course description. The supplemental examples that I put in there are not directly connected. So that's a note here with the asterisks. So in terms of a key piece of note, the political participation can be voluntary or coerced and may occur at the individual or group level. Political participation can range from behavior supportive of a regime, either independently or under state direction, to oppositional behavior that seeks to change governmental policies or to overthrow the regime. A great concept to think about this with political participation is voting, because we see that even some of our more authoritarian regimes, particularly Iran, they have voting. They have regularly scheduled elections for not unimportant offices, but in Iran, the president, the head of government, is directly elected through voting. And of course, we see voting in our more democratic governments as well. And we certainly have seen electoral democratization when it comes to the alternation of parties in both Mexico and Nigeria. But it's interesting that when you take voting, we know that some governments um, make voting an optional. It's voluntary. It's by choice whether a citizen participates for voting. And we see other governments where voting is actually mandatory and compulsory. And when we could stereotype that a totalitarian regime like North Korea has mandatory voting, but we also know there's some democracies that mandate voting. Australia is a democracy and they have compulsory voting. You can actually be fined and your driver's license could be suspended if you are a consistent non-voter in Australia without a reason. Mexico is one of those countries from our AP6 that actually has in the Constitution, in Article 36, it indicates that a responsibility of Mexican citizens is to vote. So this is where, and yet there's nothing in the Constitution that actually spells out how that expectation or how that responsibility is enforced. I think we actually saw that with impeachment of the president in Mexico. Yeah, the president can be impeached according to the Constitution, but there's really not, it doesn't spell out how that happens. Well, similar with voting in Mexico, that technically voting is an expectation of the Mexican government by its people. And so that's interesting how the Mexican Constitution talks about that without talking about what the penalties are. There's also this contention that one of the ways that citizens can participate, particularly in an authoritarian government, is if the citizens or a wide segment of the citizens view the voting as illegitimate, if they see the election as fraudulent or rigged or set up, you could have organized elements in a more authoritarian government to boycott the vote, to actually not participate in the vote. And you could view that as political participation by technically not participating, not out of apathy or just wanting to stay home and not voting, but if there's a coordinated effort to actually boycott the vote, you can certainly see that as political participation. We also see similar treatment of political participation when it comes to protests, right? And I've mentioned before when we looked at civil society in topic 3.1, that one of the key things that if you have a group, maybe a non-governmental organization or a community group, if they're upset with something in the government, they want to petition the government, they want to draw attention to a failure of the government or needed improvement in government policymaking. It's certainly, we know that around the world in all types of regimes, we see citizen groups protesting, whether it be local pollution or labor conditions or whatever. You see civil society groups protesting. But we also see that in more authoritarian regimes, and this is particularly, we see some examples of this in Iran and even in Russia, which we call that hybrid regime. You see in more authoritarian regimes, there's more likelihood that those civil society groups that are kind of independent of the government are then met sometimes by really large outpourings of government-sponsored groups or people who are given an incentive by a government to come out and counter protest those civil society groups. So that's one of the interesting elements that you see in a more authoritarian government. Sometimes that counter protest isn't necessarily an authentic, independent thought to come counter protest, but sometimes there's an incentive of material incentive by a government that's providing incentives for these more government-sponsored groups to counter protest, or maybe it's coercion, maybe it's some kind of threat or risk if those groups don't come out and counter protest. But that's certainly a behavior that you're more likely to see in more authoritarian governments when it comes to the treatment of protests. We know that certain political conditions make it likely that citizens will engage in violent political behavior, including when citizens feel that more conventional options for participation are ineffective or unavailable. And we see in all 6 of our countries examples of violent political behavior. We certainly know that there have been instances of violence. We've talked a lot about Xinjiang, that province in northwestern China. And certainly there have been notable examples of violence. China calls them acts of terrorism, particularly by the Uyghur minority community. And we know that China tends to respond to those, has responded to those acts of political violence with a lot of force, governmental force and coercion, to the point where you now have the existence of these concentration camps where upwards of 1 million Uyghurs have been reported to be detained in terms of trying to coercively shaping political socialization in Xinjiang. But the government certainly contends that some of that is a response to political violence and by separatist groups in Xinjiang. Iran, we've seen violence related to political protests. We have seen there's certainly some acts of terrorism that do take place in Iran, and Iran's government tends to blame terrorist groups who are connected with different political motives. We see Mexico, the Zapatista uprising, particularly in 1995. This was definitely an act. It was definitely violent, particularly in that southern area of Mexico, Chiapas, which is the more rural, certainly less affluent, more indigenous, where the peoples of Chiapas felt that they were being overlooked with these new neoliberal policies that Mexico's government was embracing. And there was an effort to use violence to essentially message to the government that indigenous rights and property rights and language rights needed to be protected. That would be the Chiapas or the Zapatista uprising of the mid-1990s. Certainly, we've seen some acts of political violence and terrorism, particularly related to Boko Haram and their efforts to create a separatist movement in northern Nigeria, a group of Islamists in the north affiliated with Boko Haram. And then down in the south of Nigeria, we've seen efforts related to frustrations about environmental degradation, economic injustice by groups like MOSOP and MEND, that in some of those cases, there are kidnappings and different movements of violence that would fall under this category of political violence. We saw certainly in Chechnya, political violence related to the separatist movement of the 1990s into the early 2000s by Islamist groups in Chechnya, looking to break the Republic of Chechnya away from Russia. And we certainly saw Putin and the military of Russia come back with extraordinarily military response to keep Chechnya part of Russia. And now Putin has empowered a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov to be an authoritarian leader in Chechnya. I'm going to reference that in a moment, a little bit more expanded on that. And then United Kingdom, an example could certainly be Northern Ireland and the acts of terrorism, political violence by the Irish Republican Army, again, a separatist movement looking to break Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom's response to that political violence for years was a military occupation of Northern Ireland. And then in the late 1990s, you saw this effort of essentially devolution, of executive power sharing, of negotiating between the Catholics who wanted more legal recognition, more legal protection, and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, and what we call executive power sharing to try to bring an end or to minimize that political violence that was taking place in Northern Ireland. So when we look at political participation, including the casting of ballots in elections, we know that across different types of regimes, particularly in authoritarian regimes, elections are meant to enhance legitimacy. They can also act as a safety valve. Even in democratic regimes, we see elections used as a safety valve. I certainly think you could look at the independence referendum in Scotland as an example of a safety valve referendum to try to let that independence movement kind of blow off some steam, if you will. We know that voting can apply checks on governmental policies through authoritarian regimes that are more likely to use citizen participation to intimidate opposition or give an illusion of influence, while democratic regimes hold elections to allow citizens to control policymaking. So um, we've seen examples of this, particularly with this word referendum. Or did I, oops. Um, so let me clarify this. So the safety valve is this idea of holding this vote, of allowing people to express a viewpoint in hopes that, in particularly separatist movements, you would see less of a likelihood in the future of a separatist movement actually getting momentum. I should have put Scotland on this list because certainly we've seen in Mexico a couple of different elections that were meant to respond to the Zapatistas. Again, this is that movement in southern Mexico, in a state of Chiapas, much a poorer and indigenous area of Mexico, that was meant to respond to the Zapatistas' demands for indigenous rights. So you had two different referendums related to those demands. In Russia, you saw that after this violence in Chechnya, after Putin put his authoritarian leader in charge of the regional government of Chechnya, there was a referendum in Chechnya that Chechen voters were technically allowed to vote on the ratification of Chechnya's constitution. And of course, there was widely speculated that this election was rigged, that the outcome was fraudulent in Chechnya. The voters of Chechnya overwhelmingly voted to adopt this constitution, but it was meant to give legitimacy to this regional constitution of Chechnya as a way to give legitimacy to this new government of Chechnya and to essentially be a safety valve. So we've seen Mexico use this voting in this manner. We've seen Russia use voting in this manner. I would argue that the Scottish referendum on the United Kingdom's referendum allowing Scottish voters to vote for independence in 2014 could be seen as a safety valve use of election. It's also an example of referenda. And so I was inferring referenda before with Mexico and Russia. Well, now we see a referenda is allowing citizens to vote directly on policy questions. So if there's a policy that's at stake, whether ratifying a constitution or voting for more land rights for indigenous peoples of Mexico, if people essentially are allowed to vote yes or no on a policy on a particular ballot, that's what we call a referendum if there's just one question, or we can use referenda if there are plural questions. And we see a whole variety of our regimes use this, both democratic and more authoritarian governments, or hybrid in the case of Russia. So the course description makes a specific reference to Brexit with the referendum about the withdrawal from the European Union. And so that's where, yeah, you should know the Brexit from 2016. Do you have to know the outcome? Do you have to know the specific vote total? No, unless it's part of a data analysis question. This would be good data for a quantitative analysis question. If it was just a question about the United Kingdom. But we know that a number of our countries have used referenda, so this is a concept you should definitely be aware of. I mentioned some referenda in Mexico in the early 1990s, mid to late 1990s. Mr. Waxler at Barrington, I reached out to him. He had some expertise on more recent referendum in Mexico, including a law in 2014 that makes referenda more likely. And this was used in 2018 when AMLO, the current president of Mexico, wanted to cancel a huge $13 billion airport deal for Mexico City. He was able to use the referenda to endorse his idea of canceling that airport deal in 2018. And as recently as a few days ago, the president of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, has suggested that a referendum could be used as a recall, that if citizens wanted to recall him in 2021 or 2022 before the end of his 6-year term, that there could be a recall referendum. And it was meant to be a way to kind of challenge his opponents and maybe to give him more power in the last part of his 6-year term. But it's really interesting the way that referendum could be used in Mexico if that actually happens. We know that in Russia, the constitution that they currently have was endorsed through a ratification referendum directly by the people. And we know that Putin and the government has wants to use a referendum to endorse whatever constitutional changes they propose going forward in the Russia Constitution. So the use of a referendum, a national vote on a big question like ratifying the Constitution. And of course, I referenced before the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, where a majority of Scottish voters voted that they did not want Scotland to become an independent country. And then more recently in 2016, what we call the Brexit. This was a question put forward by the British government at the time. Again, they probably thought it was a safety valve referendum. It's widely thought that the government that allowed this referendum, the Brexit referendum, did not think that a majority of British voters would vote to leave the European Union. And that's what the outcome was, where you saw almost 52% of voters vote to leave the United Kingdom. It was probably thought that that was just going to be a way of blowing off steam over this question of what should be the UK's relationship with the European Union. And yet the majority spoke, and we know that it has led to essentially two different prime ministers have left, David Cameron, Theresa May, and now it's up to Boris Johnson and his conservative majority to try to get this withdrawal from the European Union done essentially by the end of the calendar year, which leads to my FRQ rant in just a couple of moments. So if you have particular thoughts about participation, especially in authoritarian governments, I think it's one of the more interesting questions that we see in different AP texts, in questions of what is the point of political participation in authoritarian government? What are ways that authoritarian governments allow or shape political participation? If you have an ideal way for an authoritarian government to shape participation, go ahead and share those ideas at hashtag APCompGov 2020. I know there was some discussion of monarchists yesterday after yesterday's lesson, so I'm sure we'll probably get more of that on the hashtag. As always, I go into some multiple choice questions, and that leads to the FRQ of the day. So when our first multiple choice, when could a citizen's decision to not vote in an election be viewed as political participation? I'm going to give you a chance to look at those. And hopefully you selected that B. If it could be political participation, if there's a coordinated effort, an organized effort to boycott a vote for a particular political motive, that could certainly be seen as political participation. How about how do some democracies use governmental coercion in elections? That word coercion is essentially using force, but also, coercion could be a punishment, it could be a fine. In this case, coercion could be used by some of those democracies that choose to mandate voting, to make voting compulsory. And we see that used in some democracies around the world. How do some democracies use governmental coercion in relation to political rallies and protests? And hopefully you remember that examples I gave you, particularly from our more authoritarian, from our democracies, that we know that, I referenced this yesterday, that even in democracies, there are rules about political participation to create order. No democracy wants anarchy on their streets. So there are restrictions in the United States. We call these time, place, and manner restrictions, where the government allows the protests if those groups are conducive to certain times and places for the protests. And we certainly see that in democracies, that typically protests are allowed, but there are regulation on where and when that protests can happen in order to maintain security and order. And how about this multiple choice? What type of election is featured in the following election results? And this is where I put my data from the Scottish independence referendum of 2014 and what we call the Brexit referendum of 2016. I think I already gave you the answer. What type of election? Of course, that is referenda. So thank you for paying attention to, we got one more multiple choice. What political science concept was at the core of these? Oh, I love this question. I wrote this one Referenda was the easy one based on the data. This is a little bit tricky. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about this. What political science concept was at the core of these questions? Of course, you will not have any multiple choice on the FRQ. This would be a fun, I'm going to write this down. This would be a fun FRQ to put on quant analysis. And we're going to connect that to sovereignty. I might even try to find some referendum results from an authoritarian government and maybe a Russian outcome, and we'll see what kind of quant analysis. Anyway, I hope you came up with sovereignty. That questions about independence in Scotland, questions about Brexit, really centers on those core questions of sovereignty, both in the region of Scotland and also the UK's relationship with the supranational organization, the European Union. All right, so it is time to look at our free response question of the day. FRQ, it might be my free rant question. The argument essay assesses a student's ability to do the following. I've told you about creating a thesis, providing examples, big examples, has to be at least one country. The example I wrote today is only one country, but I think I wrote two separate examples to show you how that could be done. And you have to use reasoning to support your evidence. You have to connect your thesis in a reason that it connects, and you have to use that course concept. And I like to use that course concept throughout the thesis and both evidence just to be safe, just to make sure it's in there a lot of different ways. This is a 7-point rubric. You can earn up to 7 points, 1 point for the thesis, but do not think of that thesis as just 1 point. It's really the linchpin point, where if you don't have a quality thesis, you might only score 1 or 2 points on this FRQ if your thesis isn't complete. So even though both of the evidence paragraphs are worth 3 points each, so 6 points total in evidence and support and reasoning and connecting it to the concept, you're not going to really max out on those points unless you have that one solid thesis. So I mentioned this earlier, develop an argument that explains whether political participation through a referendum is effective at establishing political legitimacy. Use the following course concept in your response. I went to a source of authority, which is a word, of course, that we used in Unit 1. This is what I love about these types of FRQs, where they're making you connect concepts across different topics and across different units. You have to create a theme or thesis. I mentioned that. And the countries we're going to look at today, I'm hoping you predicted they would be Mexico, Russia, and the United Kingdom, which are all countries that I tried to show you examples of referenda from. I am just going to answer this with the United Kingdom. If you want to try to answer this question, maybe it's the opposite of my argument. Hopefully it's the opposite. I'd like to see what you have to say about that. And if you want to use Mexico or Russia as an example, if you want to put those on Twitter, if I have time, I'd be happy to try to give you some feedback on your argument essay writing. I chose the United Kingdom, and I wrote a lot. I'm sorry, I wrote a lot. I got a little carried away because personally, this is a favorite topic, I should say, a least favorite topic with the role of referendum. Not a fan. Political participation through referendum is not effective at establishing political legitimacy. So I'm just taking my prompt, I'm restating that, but you're not going to get credit for just restating. You got to elaborate, and you have to elaborate with a reason. And you've heard me say before that reason has to be some kind of causal word, because referendum voters can prefer policies that benefit their own self-interest rather than policies that benefit the greater good. I'm a James Madison Fellow. I'm a Madisonian. I took the James Madison argument here for those of you who study US government. So referendum voters can prefer policies that benefit their own self-interest rather than policies that benefit the greater good. I want to keep on ranting here, elaborating with another sentence or two. Political participation by referendums is not effective at establishing political legitimacy. Again, I'm repeating that prompt, but I'm expanding on why, because these types of elections are a source of authority. Here's where I've already connected that course concept in. I want to try to do that 3 different times in both my thesis and each of the evidence to really lock in on that course concept. These types of elections are a source of authority for the majority of the population, and political legitimacy is difficult to establish when the interests of the minority are just ignored. So I'm arguing that political legitimacy is weakened from the minority point of view. In addition, referendums can weaken political legitimacy because some governments have found it difficult to enact the will of the people, as seen with Brexit. So here's where a hint at what country I'm using. I'm actually using the United Kingdom twice in my argument essay. And you can do that. You can pick one of your countries and use it twice. Just be really, really careful and make sure those are definitely separate examples that you're using. And I tried to do that here. But they both actually relate to Brexit. So United Kingdom is a good example of how political participation through a referendum is not effective. Again, taking the prompt, turning it into an argument, connecting it to the key critical, the critical concept is source of authority, which is down lower in here. But making sure I'm taking the prompt, restating that as an argument, and making sure I am giving a reason why I think this. Because the 2016 Brexit vote shows that referendum voters can prefer policies that benefit their own self-interest rather than policies that benefit the greater good. Policy making on the withdrawal from the European Union based on a referendum vote was not effective at establishing political legitimacy because this type of election was a source of authority for the majority of the population that preferred withdrawal from the European Union. And political legitimacy is difficult to establish when ignoring the interests of the minority who wanted to remain in the European Union. So this idea that source of authority, sure, it's a source of authority for the majority, but a referendum ignores, because it's a yes or no vote, it ignores entirely the other side. There's no compromise with a yes or no vote. It's yes or no. And so yes, it's a source of authority for the majority, but it definitely ignores the wishes of the minority, which weakens political legitimacy. So that's the first part of my evidence, of small rant against the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. I chose to continue the rant in my second evidence paragraph with, I think, different evidence. The Brexit referendum in the UK was also an example of how political participation through a referendum is not effective at establishing legitimacy because the UK's government had such a difficult time enacting the will of the majority to withdraw from the European Union. It's almost 4 years ago since Brexit, and they still haven't gotten it done. Sorry, I digress. The House of Commons and Parliament are a top source of authority. I want to drop that word in again. If I can drop it in 3 times, do it. Take that concept, put in your thesis, put into both of your evidence paragraphs. The Commons and Parliament are a top source of authority in the UK's government when Parliament is unable to enact the withdrawal from the European Union. Political legitimacy in the UK is weakened because people view this source of authority as lacking the power to implement a policy preferred by the majority of referendum voters. So they haven't been able to get it done. The majority wanted it. You have the top policy making body, the source of authority, Parliament, not able to get Brexit done yet. And this weakens political legitimacy. So I hope you see that I'm trying, it might sound repetitive, but it's clear. I want to go back to really clearly state that thesis, to give a clear reason. And I'm trying to bring that thesis in repeatedly in the evidence and making sure that I'm repeatedly using that course concept and that I'm not missing any part of that prompt, because I want to make sure I'm answering all parts of that prompt throughout my argument essay. Those are the mechanics that I really think, if you're writing clearly, you're going to really give yourself a chance, and you're elaborating clearly, you're going to give yourself a chance to maximize your points on the argument essay. So again, we are looking at 3.5 today. We're looking at political participation. We're going to continue looking at political participation tomorrow in 3.6. Specifically, we're looking at different types of elections like referenda and the use of elections as a safety valve. Certainly this connects to topics from Unit 1's democracy versus authoritarianism and democratization. We'll continue looking at those connections tomorrow in 3.6. as kind of a thought provoker, you can put this on Twitter. How do you think COVID-19 might affect political participation? I know if you're following American politics, there's lots of questions about how COVID-19 might affect voter turnout, how we vote in November. But when you think about our core countries in comparative government, how might COVID-19 impact political participation? Be curious of your thoughts, or if you've seen some current news, you can link those at the hashtag. Tomorrow, I'm going to do another argument essay, and then I'm going to finish Unit 3 off. I'm going to try to do some quantitative analysis toward the end of Unit 3. But if you have suggestions on an argument essay, a prompt that connects with political participation in authoritarian regimes, let's focus on participation in authoritarian regimes. If you have a suggested prompt or and a concept that you want to connect that prompt to, please put those suggestions at hashtag APCompGov 2020. Thank you very much for tuning in. Again, if you know someone who's struggling to get access to technology, invite them to message the College Board. I will see you again tomorrow virtually on Wednesday as we continue looking at political participation and the forces that impact political participation. Thank you for tuning in to Room to See. Well, there's always room to see how countries compare. Be well.